In March 2003, the United States invaded Iraq. In his address to the nation on the day US troops were sent into Iraq, then US President George W. Bush highlighted the supposed necessity of the war for the security of the United States, but also the intention to liberate the Iraqi people. He said, this is not good, is it?
I'm fixing it.
This is spoiling my dramatic opening. Okay, let's try this again. So, getting back to President George W. Bush, he said, "We will pass through this time of peril and carry on the work of peace. We will defend freedom. We will defend our freedom. We will bring freedom to others, and we will prevail." The idea of bringing freedom to others emerged as a theme across the speeches about the Iraq War, often in the claim that the US would bring freedom to the world just as it had done in the Second World War. Of course, the idea that either the Second World War or the Iraq War were for the freedom of others is highly problematic. But that's not what I want to talk about today. The notion of the good war, the war that will liberate people, that will make the world a better place, has a powerful appeal, whether or not it relates to the facts. The ambition certainly resonated with Western self-perceptions about being particularly advanced, progressive, and freedom-loving. It was also very much in sync with how the US armed forces present themselves, of how they conceive of themselves, namely as the forces for good. The US Navy, for example, used the strapline, "a global force for good," until very recently, until 2015. Inasmuch as the war against Iraq was clearly presented as not just about defending the United States and its people, but as bringing freedom to the Iraqis, it was therefore part of a wider phenomenon. The presentation, or indeed production, of Western war as making the world a better place. What I call in my book ethical war. I've been interested in this phenomenon for the last decade or so, and I have a book due to come out which is called War and the Politics of Ethics. The book examines the practice of what I call ethical war by analyzing aspects such as precision bombing, the use of cultural knowledge to make war ostensibly gentler, and the developments in military ethics education. I believe that visions of ethics have been enormously significant in justifying Western wars across the globe, but also in configuring how Western wars pan out. In this discourse of war, ethics is treated as an objective standard that serves to limit the violence of war. It limits, supposedly, which wars we embark upon and how they are fought. In this way of thinking, ethics is something that we can discuss and discover outside of what we do. Ethics is created as a pure ideal, or as a set of pure ideals that we can aspire to. This means that ethics is treated as separate from and outside of politics. You might even say that ethics is the constitutive outside of politics. By looking at the world in this way, we are unable to see how we make ethics in the first place, and to see how ethics itself is political. Therefore, my book looks at ethics as practice and shows that instead of acting as a constraint on how we make war, the reverse happens. Claims to ethics actually enhance the violence of war. My work, for those who are theoretically inclined, is inspired by French philosopher Jacques Derrida, and he once noted that ethics has become a well-concealed political violence. This is, in a nutshell, what my book tries to reveal in the context of Western wars. Today, I want to approach this problem from a different direction, really, by looking at military refusers. Whilst the political military establishment promoted the Iraq War and the war against terror as a good thing that would bring freedom to other people, a number of soldiers wanted no part in this war. They objected to the war, refused their duties, or removed themselves from the military in some other way. Some of these refusers attracted attention at the time, but I'm struck by how little people in international studies, international politics, have actually looked at these soldiers. This surprises me because the field is interested in the ethics of war. There has been a lot of debate about what wars are ethical in general, whether the Iraq war has been ethical, chiefly through the framework of just war thinking. It's also surprising because there's been a lot of critique of the Iraq war and more generally the idea of liberal war. And it's further surprising because the field has been incredibly interested in resistance, in how people try to resist certain practices in international politics. So the field seems to be interested in ethics, war, and resistance, but few scholars seem terribly interested in what those people had to say who resisted war and ethics in the incarnation of the war in Iraq. That isn't to say that no one has thought about this. There is a fascinating book by two anthropologists called Matthew Gutman and Catherine Lutz. The book is called Breaking Ranks. There's also some work by legal scholars who are interested in the regulatory framework that conditioned what soldiers were able and unable to do. And finally, there is some considerable work on dissent in the military, on soldiers that have come out as war resistors. And this work is chiefly motivated by a normative concern, that is, it assumes from the start that dissenting within and against the military is a good thing. Now, you may have noticed already that I'm avoiding the term war resistor. I'm talking instead of refusers. That isn't because my English isn't very good, although I know that refuser isn't actually a word that exists. It's to draw attention to the fact that when we talk about war resistors, people seem to assume that what they are doing is that they are engaged in a political project to resist war. There's an intentionality behind it, and it's a pacifist sort of intention to get rid of war, or certainly of particular wars. I'm interested in refusers, which is a slightly different thing. I'm interested in people who cease to do, soldiers who cease to do what they're meant to do for whatever reason, without necessarily making the assumption that they do so in order to resist war. There is a difference between dissenters and refusers. Dissenters speak up against the military, but they don't necessarily refuse duties. Refusers sometimes are also dissenters. Sometimes they only become dissenters because of how the military treats them once they have already refused. But some people also refuse and never say anything about it, and we can't assume that they are resisting war in the sense of resisting war as a practice. That soldiers refuse to fight in Iraq is neither new nor surprising. In every war, there have been soldiers that have managed to remove themselves in one way or another. The Iraq war was immensely controversial. There is no reason to assume that soldiers should not have some of the views that the general population had about the war in Iraq. But these refusers allow me to explore some questions that I believe more traditional accounts of the ethics of war treat as already answered. These questions are, how is it that ethics is produced in this particular way rather than another? Or put differently, how have we come to believe that particular practices fulfill the requirements of ethics? What comes to be excluded in this from consideration in this account? And how does such an account undermine itself? I'll return to these questions at the end of the lecture. But what I want to do in the lecture is to give you a very short introduction into the phenomenon of military refusers and their situations. I then want to tell you a story about one particular refuser. I then want to tell you something about how refusers are sometimes perceived in the dominant discourse. And finally, I want to tell you why I believe this to be insufficient and what we find if we use the questions that I have just given you. And I believe I have this on the PowerPoint. So as I noted in the very beginning, the Iraq war was presented as defending freedom of the West, but also the freedom of the Iraqis. Despite this, a number of soldiers wanted no part in this war, having served there already or before they went for the first time. In January 2004, for example, Jeremy Hintzman became the first US soldier to seek refugee status in Canada after deserting to avoid deployment to Iraq. He had unsuccessfully attempted to be recognized as a conscientious objector on moral grounds, even before the invasion of Iraq, and in connection to the invasion of Iraq had invoked his duty to disobey illegal or immoral orders. In March 2004, US Army Staff Sergeant Camilo Mejia surrendered to the military. He had made the decision not to return to Iraq while on leave in the United States in October 2003 after serving about 6 months in Iraq. After failing to find a legal way to be discharged, he went underground. He was court-martialed after he surrendered to the military and served 9 months in military prison. In July 2005, Kevin Benderman refused to deploy to Iraq after his application for conscientious objector status failed. He was court-martialed and imprisoned for 15 months, demoted and dishonorably discharged. Benderman had previously served in Iraq from March to September 2003 and won 2 Army Commendation Medals. In July 2006, First Lieutenant Aaron Watada became the first commissioned officer to refuse to deploy to Iraq, declaring his belief that the war was illegal and that participation would make him complicit in war crimes. His court-martial was declared a mistrial. These soldiers attracted some media attention, but they were, of course, not the only ones who withdrew their cooperation from the military. So I think we need to ask at least 2 questions. Were these isolated individuals, or were they reflective of a wider phenomenon? And why, given this is the land of the free, were these soldiers, some of whom who had previously served with distinction, unable to find a legal way to withdraw from a war they objected to? These 2 questions are interrelated inasmuch as the question of the scale of the phenomenon depends on whom we count as a refuser. According to the Government Accountability Office, only 424 military personnel applied for conscientious objector status between 2002 and 2006. Its 2007 report therefore declared that the number of formally reported applications for conscientious objectors among military personnel is small relative to the total size of the armed forces. This seems difficult to dispute. The figure of 424 applicants for conscientious objector status is incredibly low compared to earlier wars. In the Vietnam War, for example, people who successfully claimed conscientious objector status, the number was 170,000. Of course, you had the draft then. But there were between 1,500 and 2,000 conscientious objector applications during the first Gulf War, which was very, very, very short. It would be wrong to think that only 425 military personnel tried to get discharged through the conscientious objector route. Even the Government Accountability Office acknowledged that the data was limited in the sense that these sorts of claims often get illegally turned down by sergeant chiefs or officers without being reported to headquarters and formally processed. This is a widespread problem, so we have absolutely no idea how many people actually would have liked to make a claim for conscientious objector status. Conscientious objector status is, of course, not the only way to withdraw cooperation. Many sought discharges under other routes, such as on the basis of illness, personal hardship, having gotten caught taking drugs, or when this was still possible, coming out as gay. This, however, is not a good route to get discharged because it, by and large, always means, or a lot of these routes to discharge, means losing benefits, such as the funds for college that you joined the military for in the first place, or health care. Indeed, some soldiers lost the right to treatment for conditions such as post-traumatic stress disorder that were a result of serving in the military in the first place. Other soldiers self-harmed in the hope of being discharged. In addition, a 2007 CBS investigation found that more veterans committed suicide in 1 year than had been killed in combat in Iraq. In fact, suicides amongst active duty military personnel and veterans later reached such proportions that the US Army called it tragic and alarming. In 2009, there were 239 suicides in the Army and an additional 1,713 suicide attempts across the Army. This is not counting risk-taking behavior, which may also have gone in this direction. Finally, a considerable number of soldiers simply left. 4,361 active duty military personnel deserted in 2006. To put this in context, desertion increased by 80% in the years following March 2003 compared to the previous 5 years, with almost 25,000 having deserted. Clearly, a lot more people than 425 people wanted out of the war entirely. Indeed, many more than 425 removed themselves from the military, although we don't necessarily know why. In addition, there were soldiers who served, but conspired to fail to fulfill their duties while on deployment. Testimony from veterans frequently referred to search and avoid missions, a play on words on the search and destroy missions that they were meant to be on. So if we're interested in the larger sense of refusers as I am, conscientious objectors are at best the tip of the iceberg. It's very difficult to tell how many refusers there are. Without doing voodoo mathematics and adding them all up, we can't tell. Nevertheless, in the context of the 2.5 million military personnel that were deployed to Afghanistan and Iraq, my rough count still suggests that it's a relatively small phenomenon in comparison to the scale of the war effort. To that extent, maybe the collective lack of interest in these people is understandable. Put differently, while pacifists may hope that refusers finally fulfill the hope articulated in Carl Sandburg's poem that someday they'll give a war and no one will show up, it doesn't look like that's likely to happen anytime soon. However, nevertheless, thousands of soldiers walked away from the job they had signed up for, the war that they had trained so very hard for, often facing serious hurdles in doing so and accepting life-changing consequences as a result. Those of us who study war must surely be interested in why this was happening. In my view, we need to look at what this phenomenon tells us about how the ethics of war is produced and what is left out of that account. I want to now look at one particular refuser. I've purposefully not chosen one of the ones that were in the headlines at the time. I want to look at somebody called Joshua Key. His memoir is actually written by a journalist called Lawrence Hill, and it's entitled The Deserter's Tale, the story of an ordinary soldier who walked away from the war in Iraq. So we know the desire, of the outcome of Key's desire to leave the military from the start. In the memoir, Key is depicted as joining the military not out of noble reasons, but out of desperation in order to support his growing family. His story starts well before he signs up. The book begins with an account of Key's childhood. Born in 1978 in Guthrie, Oklahoma, he grew up in a 2-bedroom trailer on his grandfather's farm. He describes his childhood as impoverished and marked by violence, and indeed brutality, by men's violence against his mother. As he puts it, before I could survive and escape the war in Iraq, I had to survive my own childhood. His grandparents are depicted as having provided some stability, however. Despite the bleak account and his admission that when he grew up, he drank, got into fights, trashed 2 cars, he insists that even when he was very young, he knew right from wrong. And he gives a list in the book of the examples of what he would have considered right or wrong, culminating in this summary of his view of war and soldiers at the time. So he says, I can guarantee you this. If any man had told me he had deserted our army in wartime, I would have called him a coward right to his face. There were just some things you didn't do. By the time I was in high school, I felt it would be an honor to serve my country at war, and even to die for it. I couldn't imagine any circumstances in which an American soldier would walk away from his own armed forces and betray his country. Of course, the title of the book has already told us that he would end up doing just that. And in fact, the first sentence of the book captures the radical unexpectedness of this outcome. He says, "I never thought I would lose my country, and I never dreamt that it would lose me." The story is therefore set up as a profound transformation, a coming-of-age story of a particular kind. But at the same time, Key is represented as already possessing moral competence in childhood and continuing to do so through his transformation. This is crucial because while he is presented as reassessing what is right and wrong in the context of his country being at war, he also is and remains an ethical subject able to assess such issues and in control of his destiny at the same time. While Key says that he had absolutely no objection to war when he grew up, he became increasingly uncomfortable with what his war involved. Basically, what he was doing in Iraq was in raiding people's homes in the hope of finding terrorists. He reports having raided about 200 homes. Over time, however, he realized that he was arresting and intimidating people who were very much like him in the most surprising ways. Poor, with almost no way to escape their miserable situations. When some of his colleagues finally play football with decapitated heads, he concludes that far from acting as a force for good in the world, as the US military claims, the US armed forces had become monsters in a residential neighborhood. In other words, he started to doubt the idea that the war was ethical and started to see the politics of harassing people who already had limited options, people very like himself. As a result, Key's conscience begins to assert itself. He says he likes to think that it was his grandfather's voice, the voice of right and wrong, that woke him from the long sleep he fell into during military training and in the first month of the war. While the US military presented itself at the time and continues to present itself as promoting values, Key alleges the opposite. He says, during the time he served in the war in Iraq, soldiers and officers of the American forces violated the very values that we claim to uphold in our own nation. This creates for him a conflict of conscience. As he tells it, the reawakening of this conscience is rooted in who he is, in what he learned in his childhood. It's very uncomfortable for him because he can't find a way to excuse his behavior. If you have beaten and killed an innocent person, he says, and if there remains a shred of conscience in your heart, you will likely not avoid anguish by saying you were only following orders. We each have to find what we believe to be the right way to live. While he considers the army responsible for having put him in this situation, he also considers that this is no excuse for his own failure. He says he holds the army in judgment for the repeated abuses of Iraqi civilians, but he holds himself in judgment too. In some, he acknowledges that he is responsible for the things he did. So finally, while on leave in the United States, he comes to the conclusion that he can't return to the war. He says his conscience told him that it was wrong to return to Iraq and to keep doing the things he knew to be wrong. So what should he do? What in this context should he do? Now clearly we expect soldiers not to participate in abuses, in illegal and unethical acts. The outcry over the abuses at Abu Ghraib, the Haditha massacre, and many other such events tells us this. We hold individual soldiers responsible for their part in such events based on the idea of individual autonomous agency. They are responsible for what they do. Soldiers may claim that they were following orders when they commit such crimes, but this defense is not at all straightforward. Soldiers indeed must disobey manifestly illegal orders. Many of us also believe that conscience should be free, or is or should be free. Thus, if something is against your conscience, you shouldn't have to do it. Put differently, conscientious objection is considered legitimate and is protected. Although claimants of the right of conscientious objection don't always get universal applause from society, it is still considered a right worth protecting. It is sometimes called a hallmark of liberal democratic society. Therefore, someone who comes to the conclusion that they cannot serve in a war because it is against their conscience to do so should be able to remove themselves from the war. So let's return to Key for a moment. He had come to just that conclusion, and nevertheless, at first he thinks he has no choice but to return to Iraq. In fact, he turns up at Dallas airport as his orders require. It's only when he's told that there is a delay in his deployment for a few days and he should come back a few days later, he says in his mind the switch had finally clicked. He wasn't going back to Iraq. So he returns to Colorado Springs, joins up with his wife, and anonymously calls the Office of the Judge Advocate General to say that he's thinking of not returning to Iraq. He's advised to think it over and call again the following day. In a second phone call, when he explains that his conscience would not let him return to the war, he is told that he has to choose between going back to Iraq and going to jail. Key doesn't like these options very much, so he goes absent without leave. He just disappears himself in a way. So in sum, seeing no other way to avoid returning to his deployment, Key ends up deserting. That isn't something he has planned. He finds himself having to live underground with 4 young children and absolutely no money. The problem is that Key, although he clearly asserts that fighting in Iraq is against his conscience, isn't actually a conscientious objector. Why is he not a conscientious objector? Well, first of all, he doesn't actually make any claim to the status, so you can't become a conscientious objector without going through the process. This might be in part because he didn't understand what his options were. He didn't have very good information. He didn't get very good information when he tried. And he finally uses the internet and figures out that some other soldiers escaped to Canada and decides that's what he's going to do. And he ends up doing that. But the second point is that he isn't a conscientious objector because although he considers that continuing to fight in the war is against his conscience, his decision to return to his deployment is not protected by the right. He doesn't have what the right to conscientious objection requires, namely a firm, fixed, and sincere objection to participation in war in any form or the bearing of arms by reason of religious training and or belief. So his objection is neither based on views held with the strength and devotion of traditional religious convictions. So nowadays it can be a moral persuasion that is like religion in this sense. He doesn't have that, nor does it amount to an objection in any war, and therefore his objection is insufficient under the rules for conscientious objector status. The key issue is that he doesn't object to fighting in a war, he objects to fighting in this particular war. And so-called selective conscientious objection isn't protected either in the United States or any other country that I'm aware of. What's protected is universal conscientious objection. So if you say you can't fight in any war, then you can claim the right in quite a lot of countries, but selective conscientious objection is hardly ever protected. So Key's kind of trapped. Whether he deserts or not, he will break rules that he recognizes as important, nor will deserting mean that he moves beyond the dilemma. He confronts what Derrida calls an aporia. There isn't a right way forward. It's impossible to do the right thing. It's a real and genuine dilemma. If he deserts, he breaks the law, and he also breaks his commitment to the military and to his comrades. If he goes back to Iraq, he ends up doing more things that he has already decided are wrong. So there isn't really a good thing to do here. Key thinks that the rates are wrong, and he articulates an ethically informed view on this. He says, I didn't want to participate in an unjust war, and I didn't believe it was right that I should become a prisoner in my own country for refusing to act like a criminal in Iraq. I felt that the only right choice was to move forward, and I did so with my wife and my children beside me. So he deserts and escapes to Canada. Key is, of course, in the wrong, legally speaking. He had signed up and he had to serve. Once he had volunteered for military service, he was bound by having done so. He nevertheless doesn't want to act like a criminal and attributes his determination to his understanding of right and wrong, the values that he was taught by his grandfather. So he's making an ethical argument. And he sees himself as falling foul of everything the military stands for. He says that perhaps his childhood outrage rekindled after some months in Iraq and made it possible for me to do the one thing a soldier must never do, think for myself and question my commanders. Having deserted, he has of course become a criminal in a different sense. As he puts it, I broke the rules by having a conscience. So how should we think about people like Key, who find that they think they have a conflict of conscience, they don't find a legal way of dealing with it, and therefore they desert? There are many people who have a very clear view on this, and this view is that soldiers like Key are simply cowards who have betrayed their country, and in fact that is what he reports that he used to think when he was growing up. In this line of thinking, today's refusers are considered particularly worthy of our contempt because they weren't drafted. They find themselves in the position of being a soldier on the basis of volunteering. It was their choice. They had the freedom not to do this. And they are therefore often belittled and abused for abandoning their post. They should have known what they were getting themselves into. I have to say, this strikes me as a very poor argument. After all sorts of politicians, military leaders, and indeed academic experts failed to foresee what the Iraq war would involve, so how should soldiers have known? And I'm also not entirely sure that I believe that you can be expected to know how you're going to react to being in a situation where you are expected to kill people and there is a great likelihood of you getting killed. Whatever may be the case, many soldiers claim that they certainly expected something very, very different from what they found in the Iraq war. Veterans of the Iraq war have pointed out that they had expected to do good, that this is why they signed up. Charlie Anderson, for example, points out, he puts it this way, most of us thought that we were there to do something good. I don't think anybody joins an army or goes to war thinking they're going to do evil. Or in the words of one soldier testifying at Winter Soldier, I joined the military with the intention of contributing something positive, to do something good, to improve the whole human situation. I felt that Iraq was a good place to do that. I was very young and naive, and I was wrong. Soldiers' memoirs often circle around this issue of how being at war undermined their initial aspirations, how war changed them so that they lost their ideals and indeed eventually rejected what they initially embraced. This is clearly a very difficult situation to be in. At the other end of the spectrum of reactions to refusers, to resisted the war or walked away or did any of these things, we have pacifists who consider that those who oppose either the war in Iraq or war in general are heroes. Courage to Resist, a group providing public support to resistors, explain on their website, while there are those who would like to dismiss war resistors as cowards, the reality is that it takes exceptional courage to resist unjust, illegal, and or immoral orders. Camilo Mejia received a Courageous Resistor Award from the human rights activist group Refuse and Resist, and was recognized as a prisoner of conscience by Amnesty International. And there's even a song about him, although I've never heard it. Aaron Watada has been called an American hero because he took extremely seriously the oath he swore as an officer to the United States Army to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States. More generally, Peter Laufer, who wrote a book about soldiers what he called soldiers who say no, are in fact heroes, individuals with a remarkable strength of character required to reject propaganda and extraordinary peer pressure to recognize their own personal change and spiritual growth. It strikes me that both of these ways of viewing military refusers make judgments on the basis of a pre-given notion of what is right and wrong. Doing so overlooks, in my view, the realities of the war and the way in which ethics and politics are shaped in the practice of war rather than merely pre-existing it. Whether the refusers are vilified or heroicized, they are in both cases idealized. And that, in that sense, in both cases, their personal experience, their experience as a person rather than a figure in the discourse, is dismissed. Purity is ascribed to their actions. Whether they are celebrated or condemned, such an approach seems to me dismissive of the real situation that they face. So let's return to Key for a moment. Morally, we've already seen his problem is that he has to break his commitment to the military and his comrades to escape having to commit more acts that he considers immoral. So this is the dilemma that he faces. But the decision isn't just difficult, because the right way forward has to be decided at the point where the rules of ethics cannot point to a clear resolution, what I would call the limit of ethics. The only way not to continue acting against his conscience also leads to a wide range of other problems, other negative consequences. So legally, he broke the law, and he would be prosecuted if he stayed in the United States. Therefore, he left for Canada. Therefore, he lost contact with a lot of his friends and his family, because the next problem is that socially, he finds himself in a socio-cultural space where his conclusion to follow his conscience and to desert is not acceptable to the vast majority of his family and friends. Economically, he faces an uncertain future with no income and no assets, but the need to support a large and growing family. This clearly isn't a very easy decision to make. So there's much to make Key stop from going absent without leave rather than go back to Iraq. Although he did originally join out of economic necessity rather than explicitly for noble reasons of making the world a better place or defending the country or whatever else it may be, he refers in his story about the Iraq War to the expectation that the United States Armed Forces embrace values, that they are forces for good. Indeed, it is this tension between the image of the forces for good and the soldiers kicking around decapitated heads of Iraqis that pushes him towards a sense that he needs to do something to be able to stop being part of this. Significantly, this incident is only the tip of the iceberg. This is other people doing things. He could, he's standing next to it, and for him it is the catalyst. The problem for him isn't what the others are doing, however. It's that he believes that he himself is doing bad things. It isn't just about what he witnesses and that he's guilty by association. It is that he himself is committing violence against potentially completely uninvolved civilians every day. He raids homes and he reports having beaten civilians for absolutely no good reason. Once he has recognized this, that civilians, and recognized that the civilians against whom he exerts violence are very much like he is, like his position is in the United States, poor, with limited life chances, it is at this point that he experiences his conflict of conscience. So to put this differently, he realizes that his responsibility in this situation is his, that he is the one who needs to make a decision, that this isn't about what others are doing, that isn't about what the military is saying, it isn't what the country is saying, it is about him deciding what he needs to do in this particular situation. But this isn't straightforward in the actual situation. So, sorry, no, to some extent, the situation should be very straightforward. I think, by and large, agree that deliberate and unnecessary harm against civilians is against ethics, and that we shouldn't do it. So the currently accepted rules of ethics suggest that just harming civilians for no good reason shouldn't be done. So he's very much in line with that kind of thinking. But unfortunately, this sort of thing isn't straightforward in the actual situation. In fact, if it was, there arguably wouldn't be a question of ethics. Violence against civilians in warfare is often justified as necessary for example, force protection, to protect other soldiers or oneself, or indeed to protect other civilians. Thus, the house raids that Key participates in are justified precisely on this basis. The idea is to find people who would commit acts of violence against other civilians or the US Armed Forces. So, and within these house raids, anyone might be an insurgent, and so the temptation is, of course, to say that violence is very necessary. However, we do expect that our soldiers come to a judgment as to when this argument becomes faulty. They must disobey manifestly illegal orders, and more broadly, they must conduct themselves in line with the various legal codes that govern conduct in warfare, including the Geneva Conventions. We hold individual soldiers responsible for their actions. We hold them accountable. This is the dominant, if problematic, way to approach things when it goes wrong. And Nita Crawford has discussed this in detail in her accountability for killing. Key says that when he made his decision to go absent without leave, 3 things teemed in his brain. So let's listen to these things. He said, I wanted to hold my wife and children. I had the blood of men, women, and children on my hands, and I couldn't live with myself if I had to fight again in Iraq. So here's the next problem. The sorts of things that he's talking about aren't the things that you learn about in military ethics. The fact that he wanted to hold his wife and children, for example, are completely irrelevant to judging the ethics of the war situation. So Key considers his responsibility for his actions, but he also considers something else, something that has little to do with assessing the right and wrong of the war situation. The desire to be with one's family, and indeed the idea that continuing to fight a cruel war would make it impossible to continue to be a good father, for example, or husband, appears in a number of accounts by soldiers who served in Iraq. That is, people's entanglement in life beyond military matters to their decisions made at and about war. So even though traditional ethics don't consider it relevant, in effect, when people make a decision about how they should be acting in a certain situation, they are thinking about things that military ethics or ethics of war doesn't suggest we should be thinking about. These entanglements might matter to a sociological study of soldiers, some people might claim, but not to the study of ethics of war. But I'm interested in raising the very questions that the study of the ethics of war, I believe, treats as already answered. And so we return to the questions that I noted at the beginning. How is it that ethics is produced in this particular way, in this way that suggests that Key's own situation in his family is irrelevant? What comes to be excluded from consideration in this account, and why? How have we come to believe that particular practices fulfill the requirements of ethics, and how does such an account undermine itself? If Key's desertion is assessed against the ideal of a pure ethics that is found beyond the messy relations that make up his life, then his actions will necessarily fail to measure up. Key doesn't even take a heroic stand against the army's failure to uphold its values. Rather, he packs up his car and leaves to Canada. So the point can't be that he is a hero rather than a coward. I think it is rather much more complicated. So, this lecture has explored some of the challenges that soldiers who refuse might face. While the right to conscientious objection is protected, it is tightly defined. Meanwhile, the legal, economic, and social consequences of refusing without being able to claim the right are serious. What we then saw at the time of the Iraq War was that there was a gap between the right and the objections that soldiers had. One of the most powerful aspects, I believe, in Key's reflections on his situation concerns his own implication in the situation that he objects to. The issue for him is not just that others are committing bad acts, but the way in which he is implicated and complicit in what he objects to. Refusers, therefore, in my view, point to the ethical political challenges, whether or not they are trying to resist war. Refusers may be motivated by caring for their families, preserving their health and their life, or having changed their aspiration for their life and career, all not permissible claims in the ethics of war or the right to conscientious objection. But they are real and important parts of the ethico-political practice of refusing. We need to think about whether the right to conscientious objection, as it is currently defined, therefore is still fit for purpose. If soldiers find themselves unable to refuse to participate in acts that they object to, then how can we rely on them doing so when we want them not to commit atrocities? I believe this problem arises because of the way in which ethics is set up. What is considered good in the context of war concerns the war situation, and crudely speaking, the protection of innocents, chiefly civilians, and the avoidance of unnecessary harm. In contrast, the soldiers' own situation, their lives, fears, and families are not permissible factors in the decision as to the right thing to do. That is, it's only the war situation, not the soldiers' situation, that is relevant. Soldiers are to protect the freedom of families in the United States, while the fact that they have families of their own is considered irrelevant to the problematic. They are to defend freedom, while their own freedom is sharply constrained. They are not allowed to change their mind about their choice of profession or indeed to act in line with what they believe their conscience requires. As communities, we consider it legitimate to think in terms of the protection of our freedoms and indeed in terms of warding off of whatever we fear. This is why states claim they are allowed to control their borders. This is why some states claim that they are allowed to build walls. Judith Butler has powerfully argued that in the so-called war on terror, Western lives have been much more important, have been grievable, as opposed to non-Western lives, which have been expendable. This argument is powerful and there's much truth to it, but Butler's argument leaves out the question of the soldiers whose lives are themselves also expendable. What is more, in the context of this particular war, the rhetoric was all about protecting families in the United States, but the lives of soldiers' families can be sacrificed in the name of protecting ordinary Americans. So put differently, this account of ethics excluded what it claims to be about, and thus I believe it undermines itself. What I seek to show in my most recent work is that this happens because we accept that ethics is separate from, and indeed better than, politics. We accept that what is good can be determined and enacted without reference to who benefits. Acting ethically in and through war is seen as difficult but not impossible, a problem of determination and of implementation. What I want to highlight instead is that what we claim to be ethics is already political. Defining what is good is an extremely powerful political act. The refusers could never threaten the smooth operation of the war. Nevertheless, their claims, and indeed their very existence, threatens to expose the contestability of ethics, the way in which Western wars undermine the very values they claim to promote. And that is why I believe we need to pay more attention to them. Thank you. Okay, so how is this going to work? There are yellow cards out there. You have a question?
The demographics of soldiers plays a role in this. And the reason I asked that is there was a podcast by the Army Chief of Staff saying that the demographics and the age of a soldier has varied since the Vietnam War, that they have families back home. They're not just young single men that are 18, 19. And there's more women on the front line. So since the demographics of the typical soldier is more family-oriented, where they have more to lose back home, does that influence battlefield ethics?
I think it does. It depends on what you mean by battlefield ethics. I think it certainly affects the ethico-political problem that I'm trying to point out. So you have people serving in the military who have, some of whom have joined out of economic necessity. They have made a career choice, for example. They may have made a choice that they need to do this in order to be able to go to college. So they have a lot to lose, as you say. Some of them are older and have families, so when they are making the decision that something that is going on in the war, but that their superiors think is right, but they think is wrong, if they have to step away and say, I'm not going to do that, they are then jeopardizing their whole life and their career plan. Whereas in the Vietnam War, people were drafted, served for a year, they were very young, and their future life plans perhaps didn't come into it in that way. So yes, I do believe that that makes a difference. So it's part of a wider trend of the professionalization of militaries across Western societies. The other side, which you also alluded to, is that of course when you had the draft, there was a much broader lobby within the population to make sure that soldiers were not exposed to unreasonable situations, because it could have been anyone's children, although we also know that some people's children are better at getting out of the draft than other people's children. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. To what extent do you think these narratives of refusers as cowards or heroes, is this a gendered narrative? And how might that change as we introduce more women into combat positions?
I don't, this is an excellent question. I haven't thought this through. I haven't particularly explored any women refusers, although I have read about some of them. I suppose there is a danger when you have a woman refuser that some people will think, well, she shouldn't have been there in the first place. No wonder, you know, she's just afraid. Although you get a lot of the, well, come on, admit it, you're just afraid of dying. It's just about fear in relation to male soldiers. So I would have to think about it more. I have to be entirely honest with you. Because the percentages are still so much towards male soldiers providing the, you know, far more of the soldiers, it is a much smaller group, so I don't see it as affecting the phenomenon of refusing in that sense anytime soon. But thank you for your question. It is something I should consider. Yeah.
In one of your articles, you spoke about giving the soldiers options of having non-combative roles. And then, so the soldiers that I guess they're in the war and then they choose to not go back, are they able to still, I guess like an alternative, to have those non-combative roles offered to them instead of going back to fighting in the war?
Okay, so this isn't actually my own article, so I have not argued this. It is the case that there are different levels of refusing or conscientiously objecting. So some people object entirely to participating in any kind of military organization whatsoever. Some people even object to participating in state institutions altogether. So when the right to conscientious objection was first introduced, it was in order to deal with people who had religious convictions that stopped them from participating altogether. And then if you were part of one of these religions, you could sometimes get out of it altogether. In some situations, soldiers are offered, as you put it, non-combative duties. So you don't have to fight in the front line. You can do something else, you know, maybe even back in the United States or still in Iraq, but not in combat. Now, some people will object to that role because that would still be facilitating the war that they are objecting to. So most conscientious objectors that I'm aware of haven't wanted to accept this because what they're objecting to is being part of the machine, as Key puts it at one stage.
I have one more question.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
I know you were saying that they can get prosecuted and they can go to jail if they are prosecuted. Is the time different, like the time that they are going to be prosecuted and go into a military prison? Is it different for everyone, or I don't know how they would base that?
I don't actually know exactly how they come to the conclusion of how long people serve in military prison. It tended to be between 6 months and 18 months in the refusers I have looked at, but I can't actually explain what the time differential is. I'm not entirely sure that I understand your question correctly yet. So is your question, why do we keep getting involved in wars?
When we know the results of war, which you stated, so many suicides, so many problems, so many issues.
Okay. Well, I think because it's a genuine dilemma. Because we look at the world and we see things that upset us. So, you know, we see people being oppressed and abused. You know, the Taliban are not really terribly nice to women, and this upsets us. And we don't know what to do about it. And so that becomes part of the discourse. There is, of course, the other thing that sometimes we feel afraid, we feel threatened. In relation to Iraq, there was the famous claim that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. So we have an emotional response to problems that we think need resolving in some way. And we have, as societies and as the world, not come to a conclusion as to how we can deal with these problems. I mean, we think perhaps we've gotten better at some of them because we tend to want to negotiate before we go to the military response. But I think some of these issues remain really upsetting. So I'm not one of these people who thinks, well, you know, it's just stupid and we could just stop not worrying about it. I see entirely why we get upset about these kinds of problems and why we want to do something about it. And then I think part of the problem is that intervening militarily feels like we're doing something. It's different from other types of acts like negotiating and sanctions, which have their own problems. I mean, sanctions can be even more destructive to the civilian population than military intervention. But military intervention has the benefit of being very active. So we think we're doing something, and you know, it's not a solution to simply say, well, let's ignore this. I mean, this is what we've tried with Syria, and it's not really made the world better either. So I think it's a genuine dilemma.
In your research, did you notice any correlation between what types of wars or what events would trigger a refuser to become a refuser? Like what key factors would be, like make a military person understand that this was something that maybe no longer consciously wanted to be a part of anymore?
Okay, I couldn't say that I can say that there is a correlation, so I haven't looked at it quantitatively or whatever. What most people always talk about is that in every refuser story there is an epiphany. So they have had some sort of an event that they went through and they just simply couldn't they just simply thought was wrong. So if you think at Hugh Thompson in the My Lai massacre, you know, who was seeing his own people attacking villagers, you know, it's just, this is too much. It's the event that triggers. What seems interesting to me is that one of the refusers, I look at Carlos Mejia, I don't think he has an epiphany. He keeps talking about how he was upset about prisoner abuse, but that's actually not what triggered his refusal. So I have a sense that it's very different for different people, but by and large, it is something that they witness or something that they've already become a part of, and they think, you know, this is just a step too far, I've got to do something about it. What intrigues me perhaps more, this is not an answer to your question, but I was once told when you're on television you should say whatever you want to say as quickly as possible before they cut you off, so I'm going to try this technique. Is that there are refusers in every war, and during the war they are incredibly unpopular, of course, because they are seen as traitors to their country. Well, we have sub-story here, of course. Iraq war was very unpopular, so some people were very, very much in favor of them. What absolutely fascinates me is that with almost every group of refusers, retrospectively, we have come to completely reevaluate what they did at the time. So whereas they may have been executed at the time for deserting, we then think differently about them. So Thompson, in the first instance, was considered to have done the wrong thing and to be court-martialed. In the end, he got a medal. So we change our minds. And I'm from Germany. You will have probably picked up something of an accent here. What is fascinating is that deserters in the Second World War, those people that deserted the Wehrmacht, where I kind of retrospectively think, whatever their reasons, bloody good decision. Because anyone who withdrew their fighting power from the Wehrmacht in that context, we've got to say, that was in the end a good thing. It took German society an incredibly long time to rehabilitate deserters, because deserting has such a negative connotation. It's walking away from supporting your state. So even when for decades we'd already decided that the Third Reich was evil, it was the worst thing that Germany had ever done, it took us forever to rehabilitate deserters. And the justification that was offered was, well, we don't know that they did it for the right reasons. Well, who cares on one level? Because the effect, you know, we would approve of the effect now. So it's interesting how societies rethink deserters in the aftermath.
Fortunately, the U.S. as of right now is not like other countries like South Korea, where I'm from, where when you turn 18, men have to join the army. So in the U.S., you choose to join the army, whatever that motive or incentive that may be, college, education, or if you're just patriotic. How significant is the level of autonomy, the level of responsibility that soldier bears?
So some people consider that because you choose, you then shouldn't have a right to refuse, right?
Yeah, so that's...
I don't agree with that. Obviously, you know, if you get drafted, I think it's pretty essential that the right to conscientious objection is available, because you have absolutely no choice. But there are at least two problems I have with the notion that volunteers shouldn't be able to refuse. Number one, volunteering isn't all that it's cracked up to be. So people are in very, very different situations when they make the choice to join the military. So for some people, that may be the only way to feed their children. It may be economically necessary. So some people talk about the economic draft. So to say that the only kind of draft is the one where a letter arrives and says, present yourself at this station to, you know, become a recruit and so on, I think is a narrow conception of the draft. Number two, I think when you volunteer, you don't know what you're getting yourself into. I couldn't say whether I would be any good at fighting in the war. I couldn't say whether I would be able to defend my country if I had to. I have absolutely no idea. Now, people, of course, will make some sort of a judgment about that. Only if you believe that you could do that will you join. But I think it's perfectly possible that you find out when you get there that you can't do it, or that you have been involved in so many, you know, that it's like a cumulative effect, that you do it for some time, and then you think, well, wow, what am I involved in? I can't do this. I think that is reasonable, and if you arrive at that point, I think if we are a society that claims to protect the freedom of the individual, we have to take seriously if they say to us, you know, we can't do this anymore, this is against our conscience.
So my question then would be, if that's the case, if soldiers are given the opportunity to change their minds and get out of there, how do you remedy a potential problem that, like, there's a lack of soldiers and you're potentially endangering fellow Americans?
That is, of course, what is always said. We have to be able to compel people to do it, because otherwise civilization will end, or whatever. I'm slightly exaggerating now. But very often, of course, the argument is made that you have to be able to compel to defend something. Now, you know, you might want to ask some questions about this, because if it's really the case that, you know, your country is so much under threat that military defense is absolutely necessary, I surmise that more people would be willing to fight. And it is interesting to me that the Israeli Defense Forces, which aren't known to be particularly liberal, used to have systems where they were discussing the orders with soldiers before going out on a mission and agreeing on the orders before they were doing it. So a lot of the stuff that is kind of saying, well, we must compel people, we must just tell them, makes a lot of assumptions about what's going on and the threat level and all the rest of it. So I'd want to know in much more detail whether that's really necessary. And at the end of the day, I still run into the problem that if we believe that we are a society that protects the freedom of the individual, then how do you protect it by erasing that freedom of the individual, which, by the way, is, of course, one of the oldest problems of political theory. I mean, Hobbes had something to say about this. So I can't give you a better answer, but I think sometimes we make it too easy for ourselves as against the individual soldier. Did I see hands over there?
So just wanted to thank you again for this informative lecture. Just moving forward and like reflecting on these cases, I'm just wondering like how have they redefined the relationship between the American soldier and the U.S. Army? Like, has there been any reconciliation between the two, specifically knowing that they dissented in a way that was contradictory to the way that they are like asked to behave as soldiers? Just kind of like moving forward.
I think that's an excellent question to which I don't know the answer. One of the things that was very, very striking at the time is that the US armed forces used to have a much more pragmatic approach to the whole thing. So if people wanted to leave, quite often they would just discharge them to avoid the confrontation, as it were. I mean, there are counter examples. You know, if you've seen the movie about Muhammad Ali, you'll know that he had trouble when he tried to resist serving in the Vietnam War. But during the Vietnam War, quite a lot of people were discharged in some ways, whereas in the Iraq War, it was almost as though they were seeking publicity for this and you know, enforcing the sovereign decision on these people, making an example of anybody who was trying to refuse, which seems to me to signal maybe exactly what you were saying, that they were worried that they wouldn't have enough soldiers. And we later, of course, get stop loss where people weren't discharged anymore when they were meant to be discharged, and their contract was unilaterally extended, which makes a mockery of volunteering, by the way. So I don't know what has happened since, whether there has been any kind of reconciliation, as you say. Again, something that might be interesting to look into. Yeah.
Going back to a quote that you said earlier, Western lives are more grievable and other lives are dispensable. Your example with Iraq, we're obviously focused on a lot. My question to you would be, would you argue that the so-called war on terror has in a way desensitized the public's perception of killing to the point that soldiers and refusers are not morally or ethically prepared to deal with the modern day conflictions of going to war?
Okay, I understood the first part of your question, but I'm not quite sure I'm getting what do you think soldiers, how do you think they have been desensitized? Or
Go back to your example of the Iraq War and how it's, as you said, a lot of your examples, they use that as a way to contribute to their country through patriotism. They're fighting for a good cause. Do you think in a way that has contributed to maybe a misleading perception and has caused a dramatic increase in refusers and defectors?
okay, so what I was referring to when I was talking about this idea that Western people are grievable and non-Western people are expendable is the argument by Judith Butler that whereas we in the West, North, whatever you want to call it, believed that the war on terror was for freedom and humanity and all good in the world. Actually, the way in which it's configured and set up meant that Western lives are more protected and that they were grievable in the sense that you know, if a Western person is killed, then you have an obituary in the New York Times, and if somebody in Iraq or Afghanistan is killed, we at best know the number. We very rarely know the name. We certainly never get told their life story or who might be affected by their death. So there is this very big difference. So to put it briefly, the war on terror is racist. So of course, that understanding also has an effect on how the war is fought. And what you see in some soldiers' memoirs is also the effect of dehumanizing the enemy, which is something that often happens in war. And that, of course, affects how they react to the question of, is it right to hurt this person, or where is the line where I must say it stops? So there is an effect here. I don't think it would necessarily lead to more refusals unless, as in the case of Kyiv, for example, you get there and you realize that the people you've been told only listen to force, are not like us at all, turn out to be just like us. And suddenly you start valuing them in the same way as you value yourself, and then everything becomes more problematic and you think, this isn't something I want to be involved in. So I don't know whether that answers your question, but you had a question.
Sorry, you can take one more question.
Right, okay, you've been waiting, so.
Quick question, like, do you think like the military-industrial complex and like these huge companies like profiting off of war, like encourages like unnecessary wars that put soldiers in situations that they normally wouldn't be put in, like encourages like deserting?
Right, okay, so there's a lot of work that argues that the military-industrial complex encourages us into wars that aren't strictly necessary because we have all of this gear, so we need to use it, and we're very persuaded that precision weapons kill only the people that we want to kill, and we can protect everyone else, so we get this overinflated notion of what we are able to do, and then we go to war. And now you're asking me, does this then mean that more people desert? I don't really think so. I don't know that there is a correlation. I do believe that there is a relationship between this sort of industrial military complex, our understanding of what war is, and therefore our willingness to get involved in war. So, you know, it affects the whole situation. And if it wasn't the case, we wouldn't be sending so many American soldiers abroad who then end up refusing. But other than that, I don't see a stronger correlation or relation or whatever you want to call it.